Welcome into this special meeting of Parliament. Our first item of business is consideration of motion 21369 in the name of Michael Russell on treating the Coronavirus Scotland Bill as an emergency bill. And a point of order from Neil Findlay.
So I catch my breath, I was running there. I wonder if, through your good office, we could raise some issues regarding the systems for getting responses to questions to ministers. We are here as advocates on behalf of our constituents. Excuse me. And from the start of the crisis, we have repeatedly raised a number of key concerns of constituents who are writing to us. Many are business people, many are people in employment who need urgent answers to questions that are really concerning them and their families. We appreciate that this is an extremely difficult time for the government, for public services and for everyone concerned. But we cannot close down the advocacy role that we have in Parliament. And I know that this affects every single member in here. So I wonder, given that we're only meeting once a week at the moment and we are coming up to parliamentary recess, whether there is the opportunity through your good office today, as we have a sitting day, that you can speak to the government and try and come back with a system that allows us to get more than holding answers. Now, I understand that at times holding answers will be very necessary, but we have to have a system where we can try and get answers to the very serious questions our constituents are raising with us, and that we are then seeking answers from ministers in due course.
Thank you very much, Mr Findlay, for the point of order. I would first of all say I recognise the points that Mr Findlay raised. A number of members from different parties have raised the same issues. I think that all MSPs are being bombarded with emails at the moment and inquiries and are trying to reassure constituents and provide them with information and answers. And clearly, many members are also conscious of the fact that the ability to raise those issues in Parliament is, in the Chamber, certainly will be constrained as we go into recess. However, as I tried to assure members at close of business last Wednesday, parliamentary scrutiny will continue through the recess. And there will be opportunities, for example, as Mr Findlay himself identified, to put in written questions. The very issue that Mr Findlay raised was discussed at our meeting of the Parliamentary Bureau yesterday. So all the business managers discussed this, and the Minister for Parliamentary Business, Mr Day, did respond very positively to the questions that Mr Findlay has raised this now, but were raised through his business manager yesterday. What I can assure Mr Findlay is that we're going to have a meeting, or I'm going to call a meeting shortly, of business managers this morning. And I will put that point again, but I can assure Mr Findlay that the government is certainly aware of it, his business manager and all the business managers are aware of it, and the parliamentary authorities are also aware of the importance of scrutiny continuing throughout the recess, and the assurance that constituents, through members such as himself, need to receive. So hopefully we'll be able to get back to Mr Findlay at the end of the day, if that's okay. Now, to resume business this morning, the first item is consideration of motion 21369 in the name of Michael Russell on treating the Coronavirus Scotland Bill as an emergency bill. Could I call on Mr Russell to move this motion?
Moved.
Thank you very much. Can I just inform members this allows us to treat the bill today as an emergency bill, and it means that the votes at stage 1 and at stage 3 and on a financial resolution will follow immediately after the debate. In other words, the vote in stage 1 will follow at 11 o'clock, not at decision time as it would normally. So the question is that motion 21369 in the name of Michael Russell on the Coronavirus Scotland Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. The next item is consideration of business motion 21365 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau setting out revisions to today's business. Could I call on Graham Day to move this motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Day. No member has indicated they wish to speak on this motion. The question, therefore, is that motion 21365 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. Now, before we turn to the debate, can I advise members that the nomination period to elect an additional Deputy Presiding Officer is now open and will close at 10:45 a.m. this morning. The Deputy Presiding Officer is to be elected for the duration of the response to the novel coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic. Nomination forms should be collected from the Parliamentary Business Team in room T103, and completed nomination forms should then be returned to the Parliamentary Business Teams as soon as possible before the deadline of 10:45. The election of an additional Deputy Presiding Officer will take place at 11 o'clock this morning following the Stage 1 debate. Now, the next item of business is consideration of business motions 21366 on suspension of standing orders, 21367 on referral of SSIs, and 21376 on a committee meeting at the same time as the Parliament. Can I call on Graham Day once more on behalf of the Bureau to move these motions?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. No member has indicated they wish to speak on the motions. Therefore, the question is that motions 21366, 21367 and 21376 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And again, the final issue before we turn to the debate is, could I invite the business managers to join me in room 5, that's the Adam Smith committee room, room 5 at 10:15, just to discuss voting arrangements. We're expecting, possibly expecting more members than there are voting terminals, given the social distancing that's taking place in the chamber. Any additional members this morning can contribute and take part from the public gallery, but there will be arrangements put in place to make sure that everybody can vote. Every MSP is entitled to vote and everybody will be able to vote. But if I can discuss arrangements with the business managers at 10:15 in room 5. Thank you. So, we move on to the first item of business today, which is a debate on motion 21370 in the name of Michael Russell on the coronavirus bill. We've got a new format for this because of the wide-ranging nature of the debate. We're going to have 4 opening ministerial contributions, but the Cabinet Secretary, Michael Russell, is going to begin. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I can assure you that the sum of the parts will be the same length as if there was only one, just to relieve members. Presiding Officer, responding to a global crisis and a national crisis is about people coming together to help one another through this most difficult of times. Today, as a Parliament, we're meeting to consider emergency legislation solely designed to help our country pull through. We've all seen the way that those on the front line against coronavirus, the hospital staff, those keeping social care going, the national services, have risen to the occasion. And the people of Scotland are rising to the occasion too. They are now subject to restrictions that none of us could have imagined a government would have to impose in our lifetimes. I know that the people of Scotland recognise the necessity for those restrictions, and they recognise that by working together, by following the rules, by staying at home, they are slowing the spread of the virus, protecting Scotland's National Health Service and saving lives. And that is what it is about. It is about saving lives. In this Parliament, we've been working together too, not as representatives of our parties, but as the men and women entrusted by the people of Scotland to make their laws, supported by all those with whom we work, and I want to pay a particular tribute on this bill to the team that has worked on this bill and done an amazing job in less than a week. Our laws need to change for a while in response to the coronavirus crisis. We took the first step last week when the Parliament gave its consent to the UK bill, now the 2020 Act. We have further work to do today, and we will have further work to do in the weeks ahead. This Coronavirus Scotland bill will make changes to Scotland's laws across a wide range of subject areas. It will, I imagine, Presiding Officer, be the only piece of legislation any of us will consider that amends both the Anatomy Act and the Freedom of Information Act. This bill provides essential and practical help. It will help people who are in difficulty because of COVID-19 to keep a roof over their heads or who are struggling with debt. But the bill also makes dramatic changes to our laws that many of us will find uncomfortable and challenging. And I don't shirk from that. I find them very difficult too. But I am satisfied that they are necessary and proportionate given the scale of the challenge we face. The changes this bill makes are far-reaching, but they will not be forever. Unless approved by this Parliament, the provisions of the bill will expire on the 30th of September 2020. That date is written onto the face of the legislation. Parliament can extend that period for 2 6-month periods if it chooses, but the changes in the bill will last no longer than the 30th of September 2021.
Again, that date is written onto the face of the legislation. Now, I have a lot of ground to make up, I'm sorry. I will try and take points later on. The longest this bill can last is 18 months, and then only if this Parliament has positively approved it on 3 separate occasions. I commit the Scottish Government here today to keeping under review every single change in the bill and to only keeping them in force as long as they remain necessary and proportionate to deal with the coronavirus outbreak or its effects on our society. Because of this, the bill allows us to suspend any of its provisions at any time, and even to repeal them completely earlier than in the 6-month cycle I've just described. And we will do so as soon as it becomes clear that any provision is no longer needed. These will be decisions made in conjunction with and informed by the Scottish Parliament, by all of us. Our unity in these matters is important. We need to work together if we're to defeat the greatest challenge we have faced as a nation for many generations. And unity is worth working for, no matter how hard it is. It is to the credit of everyone here that we have already agreed a great deal between the parties in this bill, but there are still areas which need further work. And accordingly, the Cabinet Secretary for Justice will confirm this morning that we are withdrawing Schedule 4, Part 5, in order to allow an intensive and wide-ranging discussion by all interested parties, including victims whose voice has not yet been fully heard, about the right way to ensure that justice continues to be done in Scotland. We will come back to this chamber with a standalone bill on this issue, along with the regulations to implement it, on the 21st of April, which is anticipated to be the next sitting day. The courts must be allowed to function. By the end of this month, we must have the means to ensure that can happen. But we want, and I stress this, we want those means to command the widest support possible. Now, the bill requires the Government to report to the Parliament every 2 months on the continued necessity of all the measures in it and the use of powers. And I am open to a discussion, as Mr Fraser knows, because he has raised it with me, about how that should take place. And if the Parliamentary Bureau wishes to put in place special arrangements for that, I'd be very happy to discuss that with them. I commit the Government to involving the Parliament and its committees and any special arrangements as much as is humanly possible in the monitoring and scrutiny of the changes made by this bill. And it is on the basis of this process of scrutiny, of constant review, of a commitment to unwind these changes as our public life returns to normal, and to the unity of this Parliament and the work across parties and between individuals. Those are the reasons I invite everyone in this chamber to pass this bill today. Presiding Officer, we have a national emergency. That's why we are today debating emergency legislation. All of us recognise the gravity of the challenge we face, the scale of the response required. This is the greatest challenge we have faced in this young Parliament's history. It's one of the greatest challenges our country has faced in modern times. We will only get through it by working together. And it is in that spirit of solidarity that we can look forward to better times. So I now pass over to my colleague, the Minister for Local Government, Housing and Planning, for specific issues in the bill. That will be followed by the Cabinet Secretary for Justice and then the Minister for Europe and International Development.
Calling Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've all been told to stay at home to save lives. And I'm pleased that so many folk out there are doing just that. Our homes provide the very foundation of our health and well-being, and we can all imagine the impact if we did not have a safe and secure place to stay, particularly during these challenging and unprecedented times. Yet the inevitable economic challenges unfolding as a result of the steps to halt this pandemic mean that there are households that will face significant financial hardship, which in turn could impact on their ability to pay their rent. We don't want anyone to feel that they could lose their home because of an unparalleled public health emergency. And that is why we're introducing provisions in this bill to prevent people from being evicted from their homes by temporarily extending the notice periods for eviction. This measure will apply across the private and the social sectors, irrespective of the time a tenant has spent in the property. The extended notice periods will apply for all statutory tenancies currently in existence in the private and social rented sector for 6 months. So for cases relating to a landlord needing to move back into a property and serious antisocial or criminal behaviour, the extension will be 3 months. We have advised strongly anyone in hardship or facing financial problems to speak to their landlords to make arrangements. And we want landlords to recognise the financial pressures and the challenges that people may be facing. In turn, we encourage all landlords, if they're having difficulty, to speak to their lenders about a mortgage break, and we have encouraged the UK Government and UK Finance to increase this to 6 months and to cover all mortgages. And we have also encouraged anyone who needs to apply for universal credit, which has a housing element, to do so. I welcome the commitment already shown by many landlords around the country in response to the outbreak. We're seeing great work being done to support tenants in the social sector through all that they do. And the Scottish Association of Landlords are asking their members to be proactive in helping tenants who expect to experience difficulty paying their rent. The Scottish Government, I'm sorry, I really don't have the time. The Scottish Government will establish a fund that eligible private landlords will be able to apply to if they are experiencing difficulties securing rent as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. This will be an interest-free loan with deferred payments, and it is intended to take the pressure off landlords in the short term if their tenants are having difficulty in making rent payments. And we expect to have this in place by the end of April at the latest. The measures being put forward in this bill, Presiding Officer, seek to find the right balance between protecting tenants from eviction due to financial pressures arising from the pandemic, while also ensuring that landlords across the private and social sector can continue to operate effectively. Crucially, though, this provision is needed to ensure that we can keep people in their homes at a time when that stability and place of safety is more important than ever. And I'd pass on to my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for Justice.
Thank you. Colin Humza Yousaf.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The most important duty of any government is to keep its citizens safe and maintain public order. And we will therefore do everything we can to maintain a fair and effective justice system. Excuse me. But we also need to respond to the realities of the current public health guidance. Our current system relies heavily on physical attendance at court and indeed physical evidence itself. Our courts are extremely busy places. Where possible, moves have already been made to switch to digital systems. The use of physical court estate has also been rationalised, and national custody hubs have been established. However, workforces across the justice system are being affected, and we must anticipate that this will continue. We must ensure that accused people, victims and witnesses are not disadvantaged or unable to access justice because they are sick or are following public health guidance designed to keep us all safe. It is essential that the justice system continues to function and public confidence is maintained at this time. We know the significant distress which delay and uncertainty causes for victims of crime. The impacts on people detained in custody and held in remand are also extremely profound indeed. We're already in a position where a backlog of cases is building up. Our best efforts, including this legislation, can unfortunately only hope to mitigate that to a certain extent. Presiding Officer, I intend to focus on the two provisions that will be the most high profile, relating to solemn trials, which my colleague the Cabinet Secretary has already referenced, and indeed to provisions around prisons. As I come to speak to the provisions around solemn trials, can I echo what my colleagues have said before me? All of us understand, all of us bear the weight of responsibility for the times that we are in. This is not a time to be bullish, not a time for egos or petty partisanship. All of us, be we Conservative, Labour, SNP, Liberal Democrat, Green or Independent, we are all part of the national endeavour needed to help us overcome this virus. If ever we needed a reminder, Presiding Officer, of the gravity of this situation, we gather in the Chamber today, the day after the youngest victim of coronavirus passed away in the UK, 13-year-old Ismail Mohammed Abdul Wahab from Brixton. I cannot, as a parent nor a step-parent, who my stepdaughter is only a couple of years younger than Ismail, imagine the heartache and devastation his family are facing. It is with his death, and sadly the many that have passed away in Scotland, across the UK and indeed globally, that we work in a spirit of compromise and a spirit of consensus. to do the best we can collectively to not just overcome this virus, but ensure that our rights are protected. And in that vein, as the Cabinet Secretary has indicated, we understand how vital the principle of trial by jury is. The Lord President's proposal acknowledged that too, but indicated the real threat to the delivery of justice that was posed by the pandemic. The solution in this bill is proportionate, but it has not secured the support, as we know, of this chamber, and we're also, of course, aware of the concerns of the profession. Accordingly, I intend to move an amendment at stage 2, which will remove that section of the bill. The Lord Advocate and I will immediately institute further discussions with the judiciary, the legal profession, the political parties here, and let's not forget them also, the victims, many of whom would want this change now. We are seeking a practical, achievable solution to meet the objectives we all have, which is to ensure that justice is done and not delayed insofar as we can prevent that, while, of course, upholding the vital human rights we all treasure and enjoy. The solution needs to be in place this month, so I am also making a firm commitment to this chamber and to wider Scotland that we will table emergency legislation for debate here on the next due sitting day, which is the 21st of April. We would also aim to bring forward draft regulations to implement the legislation at that time. I would ask all in this chamber to accept this offer, which seeks to take us forward together as we must move at this incredibly difficult time. Whatever measure brought forward, let me reiterate, will be temporary. What is being proposed will simply be temporary. Of course, after we get through this pandemic, we will always return back to trial by jury. If I may briefly speak to the other provision in the bill, which I think will gather a lot of attention, and that is the emergency release of prisoners. Moving on to that section of the bill, I have previously cautioned this chamber that we cannot rule out releasing prisoners if doing so is in the best interests of public safety, of keeping our establishments and those who work in them safe, but also keeping those who are in our care safe as well. The coronavirus outbreak is already causing a reduction in staff levels, as members will be aware. This is being well managed, but it means restrictions in the prison regime and indeed to visits. In order to ensure that we have the ability to reduce the prison population rapidly, if necessary, to ensure the safety of staff and those in our care, this bill contains provisions to allow the creation of a bespoke system for early release. This is similar to the emergency release powers the UK government already has. I should stress that this power in the bill by itself does not release prisoners. Secondary legislation is required for that, and much of the detail, including which classes of prisoner might be released, will be addressed in these regulations, and of course they will be subject to parliamentary approval. In conclusion, while much of the detail will depend on the exact circumstances we are seeking to address, I can give an absolute assurance that public safety will always be a key consideration for us, and any such release would be subject to an appropriate level of risk assessment. In this regard, members may also note that the bill explicitly states that a prisoner cannot be released if they would pose an immediate risk of harm to an identified person. We've also included on the face of the bill a number of categories of prisoner who will not be released, for example, those convicted of a sexual offence. Presiding Officer, my colleague, the Minister for Europe and International Development, will now conclude this statement on behalf of the Government.
I call Jenny Kilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I shall conclude on behalf of the Government by setting out for Parliament some of the other provisions contained in the bill. Measures were only included in the bill if strict criteria were met. We required them to be necessary as part of the response to the coronavirus outbreak and urgently required in order to be included in emergency legislation. Members will see that for every single measure, the policy memorandum for this bill explicitly sets out why, in the Government's view, it is required as a result of the pandemic and why it is necessary and urgent. Many measures are required to reflect the reality that at a time when our public services are reprioritising and refocusing to fight the coronavirus, they are also struggling with levels of staff absence and workforce disruption much higher than normal. That disruption can be expected to continue for some time. So, for example, the bill gives additional flexibility in complying with statutory duties like responding to FOI requests, laying reports before Parliament and publishing documents in a physical format. We have listened to the concerns expressed about the changes to freedom of information, and as such, I will bring forward amendments at stage 2 to adjust the provisions to reflect the Information Commissioner's suggestions on extending the period to respond to requests. Presiding Officer, the bill also takes measures to respect the additional needs that many Scots will have as a result of the financial pressures the effects of the virus are causing. So the bill extends the current statutory moratorium on debt relief from 6 weeks to 6 months. It also provides additional protection for commercial leaseholders, increasing the statutory period of irritancy from 14 days to 14 weeks, for example. The bill makes changes required because of the simple fact that we can no longer go about our daily lives or run our public services in the way we used to. Public health advice regarding social distancing and public health regulations requiring people to stay at home mean that we have to think differently about how to regulate ourselves and how to do business. Presiding Officer, these are dramatic, unprecedented measures for dramatic, unprecedented times. There is no aspect of our lives, public or private, that has been left untouched by the virus or by the measures necessary to control and limit its transmission. But the seriousness of these measures reflects the seriousness of the mission. This is about saving lives. I look forward to hearing from other parties in terms of their views on the bill's provisions and to taking part in today's debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the ministers. And I call on Murdo Fraser to be followed by Alec Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by reminding members of my register of interest, specifically my interest in property and my membership of the Law Society of Scotland. And can I just start by joining with the Cabinet Secretary in paying tribute to the Bill team for the remarkable work they've done in producing such a complicated piece of legislation with all supporting documentation in such a short space of time. The bill runs to 69 pages with a huge number of detailed provisions. In addition, the explanatory notes and policy memorandum had to be produced, and this required a huge amount of effort from a small number of individuals, and we should be grateful to them all. Can I also record my thanks to the Cabinet Secretary for the cooperative way in which he has approached this legislation, working with the opposition parties. And that is particularly important, given the very limited time that is available for scrutiny of this legislation. Most members will only have seen this bill yesterday afternoon, and we're now being asked to consider it, potentially submit and vote on amendments, and vote on its entirety within the space of a few hours. And that is a challenge for all of us. And I think we should recognise at this stage that it is likely that we will not get everything right in the very short space of time available to us. There will be aspects of this bill that we, with the benefit of time and hindsight, will realise were wrong or perhaps could have been better worded. But we are in an emergency situation, and that is why we have to press ahead with legislation without the normal level of safeguards. What this bill does is introduce a whole range of new powers to Scottish ministers, which in normal times would be deemed to be unacceptable. We are agreeing for these powers to be granted, and on occasion for human rights and for civil liberties to be curtailed because of the challenge we have in fighting coronavirus. That does not mean that these powers should be unfettered, nor that there should be a suspension in its entirety of normal scrutiny and the need for reporting by Scottish ministers. Indeed, one of the areas in which this legislation could be strengthened is looking at the need for regular reporting by ministers and how Parliament can hold government to account for the extraordinary powers it is taking to itself. We believe there is a case for a new committee of Parliament to be formed to look specifically at the powers of this bill, particularly important, Presiding Officer, when the normal business of the committees of this Parliament may not be continuing in coming weeks. And I'm pleased that the Cabinet Secretary signalled earlier that the Government is open to this, and I look forward to that being discussed in the Bureau as we go forward. Looking at the specific measures in the bill, let me start by looking at the provisions to protect those renting property. We absolutely agree that new protections should be put in place to avoid people having to move home while we have the coronavirus situation ongoing. We also need to recognise that many families are being put in a very difficult financial position because of the economic disruption, perhaps because they have lost their normal employment. So on that basis, the extension to 6 months of notice period for eviction for non-payment of rent seems reasonable. But it is worth reiterating that this does not mean that rent should not be paid, and indeed rent arrears built up during this period should be the subject of an agreement between landlords and tenants for repayment in due course. There are two other important points to make in this respect. Firstly, we would not want to see an end to evictions in all circumstances, and that is not what is proposed in this bill. There will still be cases where tenants can be evicted for antisocial or criminal behaviour. And that is important, because I'm sure we have all had situations where individuals have had their lives made a misery by antisocial neighbours, individuals who have in some cases been waiting for years to get an eviction order, and it is simply not right that they have to suffer further misery for months more because of legislation which would protect those who were behaving illegally. And the second point I make here is that many landlords do depend upon the income from private rent. For some retired individuals and couples, it might well be their primary source of income in the absence of any form of private pension. For individuals in these categories, they could face real hardship. And so what this bill does, in effect, is potentially extend the period in which a tenant might avoid eviction for non-payment of rent for up to 12 months, given the current delays with the Tier 1 tribunal. And that could cause real financial difficulty for individuals, sometimes not very well off people, whose primary source of income is one or more private rental properties. For that reason, we called for a hardship fund to be established for landlords in this situation, and I was pleased to hear what the Minister had to say about this a few moments ago, and we look forward to seeing the detail of that in due course. Presiding Officer, there is a great deal in this bill in relation to the criminal justice system, and my colleague Liam Kerr will comment more on this in detail later in the debate. The major area of concern we had was the suspension of trial by jury in more serious criminal cases. Article 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights gives a right to a fair trial, but does not specify that this has to be by jury. But it is a long-established Scottish legal tradition for jury trials to be held in solemn cases, and a removal of that right would be extremely prejudicial to those accused of a serious crime. It is our view, therefore, and it's one shared by the legal profession, that the removal of jury trials would be a retrograde step and hard to justify, even in the extraordinary circumstances that we are now in. So I welcome what was said by the Cabinet Secretary earlier about taking this back for further consideration. There are other solutions here I think need to be properly considered. One would be simply to delay all solemn trials until we're through the current difficulty. That would be prejudicial to the accused. It would be difficult for prisoners on demand. It would be difficult for victims of crime and for witnesses, but might be a better outcome than simply allowing trials to proceed with one judge. We could look more seriously at the issue of having juries by remote TV link, or there are practical difficulties with this. We could look at holding cases in larger venues where jurors could be spaced out and allow social distancing, or we could look at the testing for coronavirus of all jurors at the start of proceedings and the start of each day, in order to provide some protection for those for whom there will be in some proximity. Now, none of these solutions are ideal, but we believe they all need to be properly examined because of the very serious nature of what is being proposed to remove the right to jury trial, and we look forward to continuing these discussions in the weeks ahead. Presiding Officer, there's much more I could say, but my time is up. Can I say I'm pleased with the progress we're hearing from the Government this morning on the issues of concern to us. Assuming the amendments come forward at stage 2, as we expect, this is a bill we hope to be able to support at decision time this afternoon.
Thank you very much. And I call Alec Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful to be able to speak in the debate today on the emergency legislation relating to the coronavirus pandemic. We are in a strange and unprecedented time, and I would like to start by paying tribute to everyone who's been working on this bill to be able to get it before the Chamber today in such difficult circumstances, and also to acknowledge the joint working that is taking place across this Parliament. I think it would be also important at this time to know all those workers who are on the front line, whether that's in our health and social care services, or in the shops serving food, or lifting refuge. All those frontline workers need to know that this Parliament is going to work collectively in their best interests in this time when they are all putting themselves and their families on the line. We are facing something that none of us has faced in our lifetimes. It is still just as important, however, that any legislation being passed in this country affecting the lives of Scottish people faces proper parliamentary scrutiny. The bill tackles some difficult areas, and I can see that difficult decisions are having to be made and indeed will continue to have to be made. I should say that we face this crisis at a time when much of our public services are under massive pressure after years upon years of austerity that have left some of those services with real difficulties facing up to normal day life, never mind the crisis that we face at this time. I saw last night somebody say that today would be the blackest day in legal history if the bill was to proceed and the jury trials were to be stopped on a short-term basis. We believe that the Law Society of Scotland make a fair point when they say there is a need to have further information and the issues require fuller consideration and consultation in order to avoid unintended consequences. So I am pleased that the Cabinet Secretary this morning has picked up on those points and is proposing to address those points and bring back legislation here on the 21st April after doing so. But let me say we are facing the blackest period in our history, and the blackest days, I feel, are still to come. So we must, as parliamentarians, accept our collective responsibility to make the right and the necessary choices. In this extreme circumstance, it is clear that what is required is a balance between competing interests. That said, the health of our country should always be considered as a paramount concern, and I hope that this is the intention behind the introduction of many aspects of this bill. The difficulty lies with the competing interests, particularly in relation to civil liberties and human rights. I agree with Amnesty when they say that any restriction on the individual human rights must meet the criteria of necessity, proportionality, legitimacy, be time-limited and subject to regular reviews. And I know that the Cabinet Secretary is proposing that the legislation itself is reviewed every 6 months with the powers in this Parliament to be able to either continue where necessary or not, as the case may be. I also note the proposal for 2 monthly reporting back. I believe one of my colleagues is looking at an amendment to that today, perhaps to 1 month reporting back. But having the confidence at a time when you bring forward such legislation, having the confidence that the scrutiny and that the government being given these unprecedented powers is being held to account by this Parliament will be important. And that's why the point that was made earlier by Neil Findlay about the accountability of the government through this Parliament is so crucial. I do believe the emergency legislation is necessary, and I welcome the fact that the government have brought it forward. Indeed, I suspect that we may see further emergency legislation coming forward as we grapple with what at this stage we don't know are going to be some of the outcomes of this virus. But we must now ensure that, even if well-meaning, there are as few unintended consequences as possible, especially given how quickly we are dealing with this fast-moving situation. The economy, Presiding Officer, is going to go through a major difficult time. So whilst I accept that we need to look at what further support is going to be needed, I think we need to accept that the economy is not going to be the same as it was, and that government will have to play a far greater role within our economy and within our society in the coming months that lie ahead. Thank you.
Andy Whiteman, up to 4 minutes, please.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. And like all members, I'm sure we will have regarded the provisions in this bill as we would all have regarded the provisions of this bill and in the regulations that came into force last Thursday as something of an April Fool's had they been floated a few weeks or months ago. The Parliament's provisions for emergency legislation, however, are appropriate in these circumstances, given we face such a major public health crisis. And in such a situation, any bill's provisions should be, as other members have said, strictly necessary in the current situation, specific, time-limited and subject to review and reporting. Now, there's very little time for scrutiny of this bill. I'd like to join Murdo Fraser in commending the drafters and government officials who've been involved in this work, and all the organisations as well who've turned round briefings in a very, very short space of time last night and this morning. And for the record, I just want to make some brief observations, principally on Schedule 4, the justice provisions and the housing provisions, and a couple of others as well. Our justice system is at the heart of our democratic institutions, designed to ensure a law-abiding society, the liberty of the individual from the power of the state, and sanctions for those who transgress agreed norms of behaviour in the civil and criminal spheres. And the bill, focusing as it does on the justice system and how it can operate in the weeks and months ahead, is practical and sensible. We welcome the removal of the provisions that would give the executive powers to suspend jury trials. And we do look forward to engaging in discussions as how the problem of how to conduct jury trials can be tackled with a view to ensuring the right balance between human rights, public health and the efficient administration of justice, because it is incredibly important that Parliament achieves consensus on this extremely sensitive question, and we therefore look forward to taking part in discussions in the weeks ahead. On housing, we welcome the provisions that ensure that all statutory tenants will be provided with extended notice periods to ensure that, as far as possible, no tenant will be evicted during the emergency period. However, welcome as this is in comparison to the government's original proposals, it is not sufficient. Many tenants will be facing unprecedented declines in their income and job prospects over the coming weeks and months, and whilst it's of some comfort to know that during the relevant period you will be safe in your house, it remains open to landlords to commence eviction proceedings at any time, with vulnerable tenants having to live through the crisis knowing that they will be evicted in 6 months' time. So we argue and will bring forward amendments that there should be no notices to quit and no eviction proceedings initiated at all during the emergency. They can all wait. Furthermore, we need provisions that deal with eviction applications already in the system, and perhaps most crucially of all, for the most vulnerable group of all, those against whom eviction orders have already been granted, but which have not been enforced. And the proposals explicitly do not deal with those who have already had eviction proceedings initiated or orders to quit granted. While some comfort is available from the de facto suspension of many court proceedings, it's our view that all such proceedings should be suspended for the duration of the emergency period. On a couple of other provisions, we welcome those on land registration. This has been the subject to intense debate between the Keeper of the Registers of Scotland and the legal profession over the past few days, highlighting the fact that despite having the world's oldest system of recording titles to property, we've still not managed to move into the digital age. On debt, we welcome the debt arrangements. One of the most significant impacts of the pandemic will be the numbers of those facing unsustainable debt, not because of their own actions, but because of the financial circumstances as a result of the pandemic. On freedom of information, we have serious concerns about the proposals in the bill, and we are not persuaded that they are all strictly necessary. And I heard what the Minister had to say earlier. Look forward to engaging discussions later today. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, this legislation should give no legislator much pleasure in enacting. It has a sunset clause, which is good, but it still contains extensive powers for ministers to legislate by regulations. We understand why, but no one should be under any illusion as to the unprecedented powers we're being asked to hand to the executive. Over the coming months, it will be vital that Parliament has the time and resources to ensure the powers contained in this bill remain proportionate and necessary. In that context, Greens will be voting for the general principles of the bill. Thank you.
Alex Cole-Hamilton for up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. We live in exceptionally difficult times, and this is a piece of legislation that in virtually any other circumstances we could not have imagined supporting, but support it we will. I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his engagement and with my party over recent days, and for his remarks in respect of jury trials, which I'll come on to later. The bill was written in just a matter of hours. That is no mean feat, but it is precisely
because it was written in just a matter of hours and it hasn't been consulted upon, that we must be robust in our scrutiny of it over the course of this day. Now that the Cabinet Secretary has confirmed the removal of schedules for Part 5, we will support this bill with some minor amendments. We support it not least because the bill contains some vital and much needed changes to give comfort and security to so many people who would otherwise face destitution in the teeth of this crisis. Of great importance, as we've heard many times, are the provisions around evictions. Now, I would hope and expect landlords to be understanding in this emergency and recognise the flexibility being afforded to them by the banks, but nobody should be made homeless in this crisis, and responsible private and social tenants need that extra protection against eviction. Presiding Officer, that sense of national urgency is why the vast majority of the provisions in this bill are necessary. But we still harbour some concerns, particularly around FOI deadlines. But above all, we could not have supported the introduction of the new powers contained in Part 5, Schedule 4, around the ability of ministers to remove juries in trials of indictment for the duration of the emergency. I raised this at the cross-party meeting last week when the bill was first mooted, and I had issued drafting instructions to Clark to remove that section. I'm very grateful to hear the government will respond to that. Jury trials have been part of Scottish justice since the 13th century. They have survived the bubonic plague, the Spanish flu, and 2 world wars. They are a central pillar to our unwritten constitution and our social contract. The English Courts and Tribunal Services are pausing all trials that would require a jury until such time as they can find a way of proceeding safely. They recognise the challenge and the danger of asking juries to sit at this time of heightened infection risk, but they choose not to abandon the jury system, but to pause them while they seek solutions. Indeed, it looks as though across all the democracies in the world, no other country is ending jury trials, and were we to have pressed ahead, we would have stood alone in that regard. Presiding Officer, once only before in the history of these islands have jury trials been replaced by judge-led hearings. The diplock courts were created in Northern Ireland in 1973 so that terrorism offences could be tried in front of a judge because of risk of reprisal or tampering to juries. The focus of these provisions were around keeping jurors safe, but Presiding Officer, we are not trying to keep jurors safe from terrorists. We need only find a solution to keep them safe from infection, and I look forward to working with the government before we return in April to that end. As Murdo Fraser said, that those solutions might be bigger venues like theatres or cinemas. It might be about testing everyone on site for the virus every day, and it might involve computer link-ups. We also need to make it easier for witnesses to give testimony via computer link-ups, and I will be bringing amendments at stage 2 to that end. But there will be a solution, and we need one, because the provisions in this bill have been met with a howl of outrage by the legal profession. The Faculty of Advocates, the Law Society, and solicitors the country over have all spoken in opposition to that schedule. It is a marker of the strange times we live in that I find myself in an alliance with Joanna Cherry and Michael Gove in opposition to these provisions. I am glad that the government have heeded those calls, because juries matter. They matter because the burden should rest on the prosecution to take a group of everyday people through the evidence and through the details of the law and persuade them of guilt. Above all this, to participate in a jury is to fulfill the social contract. We cannot just simply bypass that. Presiding Officer, I conclude by saying this. We are just 1 week into lockdown, and unamended, this bill would have interrupted an unbroken tradition of Scottish justice that has endured for nearly 800 years. It is a measure that no other democracy has embraced, and it has been roundly condemned by the profession. We should listen to them. I'm grateful for the government's intention to remove it, and I assure them of our support for this bill tonight. Thank you.
We move now to the open debate, and we're already short of time, so if you could come in at under 4 minutes, that'd be appreciated. Rona Mackay, followed by Graham Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I don't think anyone in the Chamber today would disagree with me when I say that none of us want to be proposing this legislation, and none of us imagined that we would have to, but of course we must. We must ensure that we can adapt to this extraordinary crisis by following due legal process and providing clarity for organisations and the public. We're in uncharted territory, but I believe the general principles of this bill are sound, justified and absolutely essential. We're in an emergency situation. And as others have said, the very positive all-party discussions that have allowed this legislation to be drafted so quickly are welcome. These are not normal times, and party politics should be put aside. The bill complements and supplements the Coronavirus Act 2020 passed by the UK Parliament and to which the Scottish Parliament gave its consent last week. There are several aspects of the detailed bill focusing on justice, public health and the economy. We know that the majority of people are complying with the advice to stay at home to avoid the spread of the virus and to ease the burden on our amazing frontline NHS workers. And we know that, as the Minister said, having a roof over your head during this period is vital, which is why the legislation to protect people having difficulty paying the rent from eviction, prevent them from eviction for 6 months, is most welcome and necessary. Out with the bill, I also hope that measures to provide the homeless with accommodation is rapid and successful. Presiding Officer, in the short time I have, I'd like to focus on provisions relating to justice and policing. All of the measures in this bill are practical and common sense and will allow our justice system to continue operating in these extraordinary times. As we know, measures to allow solemn trials without jury are controversial and serious and will be amended and brought forward on the 21st of April with emergency legislation as outlined by the Cabinet Secretary. But it's important to say that Rape Crisis, Victim Support and Women's Aid do support these measures and they believe that this is vital to help minimise the distress of delays for victims of sexual and serious crimes. Ministers will have the powers through secondary legislation to release certain classes of prisoners, but of course this is subject to a strict set of caveats and public risk assessment. Prisoners serving life sentences, terrorists, sex offenders, untried prisoners, all those serving sentences for the most serious crimes would, of course, not be covered. The important details of these measures are detailed clearly in the bill we're considering today. Schedule 4 of the bill relates to children and vulnerable adults. Changes to enable the children's hearing system to function are being introduced, such as reducing the number of panel members required. Alterations to child protection orders and supervision orders to prevent them from lapsing are included, and again these changes are detailed in the bill, but the rights of the child will be upheld during these temporary measures. Presiding Officer, the Equality and Human Rights Commission have stated that actions to protect people that complement or enhance equality and rights will maximise consent and compliance and ultimately best safeguard public health. And that is what this legislation proposes to do. The initial time period for the law is through to the end of September, when these laws could be extendable, if necessary, through the affirmative procedure. The bill will be reviewed by Parliament after 2 months to ensure its effectiveness and proportionality. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, in this emergency situation, for all the reasons I and others have outlined, I recommend supporting the general principles of this bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Graham Simpson, followed by Ruth Maguire.
Thank you. None of us expected just a few weeks ago that we would be sitting here dealing with what is genuinely emergency legislation with far-reaching consequences for the power of the state over individuals. The encroachment into human rights is unprecedented and it has consequences. I want to concentrate my remarks on the proposals in the bill around evictions. There are around 340,000 households in the private rented sector and 550,000 in the social rented sector in Scotland. And some of those, but not all, struggle financially, and some will have lost their jobs as a result of the coronavirus outbreak. Some will have to socially isolate in the coming weeks and months, and we're all being told to stay at home. Where people have lost their incomes as a result of the restrictions imposed by government, it will take time for the very generous packages on offer to kick in. And it would be entirely wrong if people were to lose their homes in those circumstances. So both of Scotland's governments are right to restrict the circumstances under which evictions can take place. They take slightly different approaches, but the aim is the same. And here in Scotland, the bill before us today temporarily extends the notice periods for all evictions except in certain limited cases. The extended notice periods are either for 6 months in most cases, or 3 months for antisocial or criminal behaviour, or where a landlord or their family member need to move into the property. We need to make sure that, as the Chartered Institute for Housing have pointed out, that victims of domestic abuse are not trapped in their homes with the perpetrators. Now, the legislation before us today relates to the notice period that a landlord has to give of their intention to start eviction proceedings. It's not, as Aileen Campbell first promised, a 6-month ban on evictions. The reality is that it's a stop on evictions and therefore no rental income for some landlords for over a year. Many private landlords are retired. Many have 1 or 2 properties, not vast portfolios. Some rely on the income from rent to pay their care home fees, for example. 95% of landlords have between 1 and 5 properties. So by any measure, it's not sustainable that you should expect these people not to be paid for over a year. So we suggested to the government that for those landlords who do suffer loss of income as a result of these measures, there's a hardship fund put in place. And I'm pleased to hear the Minister commit to that. And I would simply invite him, if he wants to intervene on me, if he could say whether that fund could be applied for to cover the whole period that a landlord may be without money.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As I mentioned earlier on, we are looking at this Landlord Loan Fund, and we'll make that loan fund available as soon as possible and for as long as it's needed. We hope that we can have all of that in place by the end of April at the latest, as I said in my opening remarks. And we're developing the detailed criteria around about this. But we will make that loan available for as long as possible, as long as it's needed. And we envisage that that would be up to a year, and we would backdate that to March the 1st.
Graham Simpson, if you could come to a close, please.
Yes, certainly. I think that's very encouraging, and that's good to hear. And I think on that basis, we could support these provisions in the bill. It's proportionate. It's unfortunately necessary. I think on the basis that what we've heard, we'll be supporting it. Thank you.
Ruth Maguire, followed by James Kelly.
Presiding Officer, I know firsthand how worried and anxious people are right now at the changes to their lives. I have lost a friend to this virus. I'm acutely aware of the seriousness of what our communities are facing. We're in the midst of a national emergency. Stringent steps are required to suppress the spread of the virus to save lives. Public bodies across the UK must have the tools and powers they need to carry out an effective response to save lives. Across this chamber, I think we all understand that this bill cannot be scrutinised in the way that we would all normally demand. It's a huge transfer of power to Scottish ministers and through them to local authorities. And it's clear that the effect of some of these powers is to temporarily overturn and or bypass some of the human rights protections established in law by the Scottish and UK parliaments. This is legitimate in response to the emergency we're facing. That said, I'm mindful that the legal test for derogation from human rights standards is rightly high, and that most importantly, hard-won human rights protections are both most vital and most at risk at times of emergency and crisis. Extraordinary powers must come with proper limits. Regular renewal is essential, and the burden of justifying restrictions must lie with government and be open to proper, timely scrutiny and challenge from existing bodies out with the Parliament and, of course, from the Parliament itself. In giving over extraordinary powers to government, our first question should be how we take them back. Significant powers are provided to police, immigration officers and public health officials to arrest people deemed infectious, to place them in isolation and to take biological samples without their consent. These actions may at some point be required to save lives. It would be helpful for the Scottish Government to confirm what additional safeguards will be put in place where the infectious person is a child or a vulnerable adult. The people I represent will also want to know that the prompt action being taken against individuals who appear to be acting out with the strict confines of the life-saving advice and instructions will be taken just as vigorously against employers and businesses who put staff in harm's way. I know there's also been concern around a relaxation of child protection and safeguarding legislation, which would enable an individual barred from undertaking regulated work with children to continue to do so. Clarity from Scottish Government ministers on the circumstances in which this power might be exercised is crucial, including, importantly, how children's rights to protection from abuse and harm will be protected. I would also seek assurance from ministers on how we ensure the protection of those whose rights are most at risk, with the suspension of legal duties to assess the needs of children with additional support needs, disability, care-experienced children or young carers. Presiding Officer, 4 minutes only gives time to raise a couple of points, and I'd like to end on this one. The cross-party working and productive scrutiny, coupled with the unprecedented reprioritisation of resources and powers, shows what can be done where there's a will. Once we get through this crisis, let's demand that of ourselves again in tackling poverty, addiction and inequality, the other things that threaten the lives of the citizens we represent.
James Kelly, followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It would have been unimaginable even a few weeks ago, the sweeping powers that are embedded in this bill, imagining that it would have been passed by the Parliament in a matter of a day. However, the circumstances in which we live, where we fear for those in our communities, we fear for those who are close to us, means that the Government is right to legislate in these emergency circumstances, and we will support the general principles of the bill and no doubt the concluding bill at stage 3. I'd like to touch on a number of matters. First of all, the provisions in the bill in relation to prisoner release. There's no doubt the prison environment is a very challenging one. We spoke many times in the Chamber about the overcrowding in the prison estate, and it's been reported that there are 111 cases of people displaying the symptoms of COVID-19 in prisons that have had to be self-isolated. And that can be understandable in the circumstances in which people are living in the prison estate, and also very concerning. Therefore, the provisions in relation to prisoner release are correct for prisoners who are coming towards the end of their sentence and where there is no threat to public safety. I wonder if I might ask if the Justice Secretary or Mike Russell, if he's summing up, can address the issue of public safety. Because in terms of prisoners being released, I believe that it is important that they are tested for COVID-19, because it's important that we have a duty of care to those prisoners and also to those who they're going to come into contact with in their communities, and also the support workers who are necessary to give them the proper support to ensure their smooth transition back into the community. So I would ask that issue that is not mentioned in the bill be addressed. In terms of the issue on the jury trials, I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's announcement that will be taken out of the bill with an amendment at stage 2. It seems to me that the Government moved too hastily on this proposal and also failed to explain why it was required. It seemed to me that they described the fact that there was a crisis and the need for a power, but without outlining why that was necessary. I welcome the fact that there's going to be a proper consultation between now and the 21st of April. I think the strength of the opposition that we've seen overnight, particularly from organisations like the Law Society, shows that the Government had got it wrong and had moved far too quickly on this issue. I think as we move forward, it's important that we build consensus, not only from organisations like Victim Support and Rape Crisis Scotland, but also among key figures and key organisations within the legal profession, because it's important at this time that legislation is built with consensus and support both in the Parliament and outside the Parliament. Final point I'd make is in terms of the review period. Never before have we seen powers like this go through in a day. Therefore, I think it is important not only to look at the review time scale, perhaps reducing it to a month, but also the process that underpins that, because it will be important to review these powers and their operation and implementation as time goes on. Thank you.
Kenneth Gibson, followed by Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I first pay tribute to the Bill team and others who've worked with ministers around the clock to deliver a robust bill under these difficult and volatile circumstances. As others have indicated, these circumstances are unique in our lifetime. We have a common goal, and judging by the measured contributions so far, I'm confident this pivotal bill will pass today. Much continues to be said about the devastating consequences of this outbreak on our economy and society, and we must do all we can to help our constituencies and businesses through this. Like all colleagues across the Chamber, no doubt, I've been in constant communication with community organisations and individual constituents. It is a monumental task, with hard-pressed staff, reduced in number, trying to help millions, almost from a standing start. Nevertheless, if possible, I hope the UK Government will speed up the process of identifying and making payments to those who are self-employed. June is still 2 months away, a long time to wait to begin making the first payments. Many will struggle to pay their bills and loans, credit card bills and overdrafts. Some banks, sadly, have increased their interest rates from 9.9% to 39.9% for unauthorised overdrafts, while they benefit from a base rate of 0.1%. This is nothing short of daylight robbery, kicking people when they are down. And while the Scottish Government has no powers to stop these practices, I'm pleased to see it is using its limited powers to protect those getting into debt by including a temporary extension of moratoriums on diligence. The bill seeks to increase the length of the moratorium against diligence created by sections 195 to 198 of the Bankruptcy Scotland Act 2016 from 6 weeks to 6 months for moratoria established during the period covered by this emergency legislation. The bill also removes the restriction that only one moratorium can be applied for in any one 12-month period and contains a provision for trust deeds. Making it easier for individuals and families to apply for a moratorium may provide just the respite they need while awaiting payments, or for business to pick up during these deeply uncertain times. Also helpful and incredibly important to those who have been through trauma is the temporary relaxation of some requirements for legal aid applications in paragraph 22 of the bill. With these ongoing changes, we must keep Scotland a functioning country with a working justice system, and the proposed adaptations, such as the extension of time limits in criminal proceedings in paragraph 10, offer a workable solution to maintain this. Police Scotland is doing a magnificent job coordinating responses and keeping everyone safe, and we must ensure the legal framework continues to work. As domestic abuse will continue and likely increase during this crisis, although it's clear to survivors that during the lockdown they are encouraged to make their way to safety if they can. To assist some of the most vulnerable people in our society, the bill extends guardianship for adults with incapacity, the period of existing certificates and provision of services to expedite the release of adults with incapacity from hospital. The majority of measures in this bill will automatically expire 6 months after they come into force, which I believe is appropriate. A mechanism where explicit action and agreement from the Scottish Parliament is required to extend those measures for another 6 months and then potentially a third time until a total of 18 months from when this bill is passed. Scottish ministers will provide a report to Parliament every 2 months about the use of these emergency powers, and I welcome that. Presiding Officer, I thank all those working to save lives and keep Scotland going, and extend my condolences to those who have lost loved ones to the coronavirus, including at least one of my constituents, and wish those who are currently suffering a speedy recovery. Let's all keep being responsible and doing what we are doing to make sure we beat this pandemic together. I support this bill and ask all colleagues to vote in favour.
Liam Kerr, followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I remind the Chamber I'm a practising solicitor holding current practising certificates with the Law Societies of Scotland and England and Wales. The principles of this bill are to provide new powers to help the Government deal with the coronavirus outbreak effectively, and the justice provisions at Schedule 4 are therefore extensive and wide-ranging. Many are unprecedented, yet we can support many of the powers as drafted. Indeed, some are measures which are welcome. However, we are not without doubts. And there are two areas in justice where we have particular disquiet, and the Cabinet Secretary for Justice was right to focus on both. The proposal to release prisoners early from sentences is difficult. It is difficult for victims of crime and their families, who will understandably ask about the punishment element of prison and will worry about the mechanism for assessing prisoner risk being sufficiently robust. Difficult for those victims of domestic violence who fear that their attackers could be back to haunt them, and Scottish Women's Aid are right to demand robust safety arrangements, including appropriate notification of victims and intensive monitoring in this area particularly. It's difficult for the public, who will worry about their safety, particularly in times of lockdown when already stretched support organisations and local authorities may be unavailable. And to those concerned, I say simply, we are too. And by way of reassurance, I remind those watching and associate myself with the comments of the Cabinet Secretary earlier on in this regard. This proposal arises from the unprecedented and grave situation that Scotland faces, and there's no doubt that the prison environment poses a unique challenge, not least for the health of our dedicated prison staff. And I understand why we must think the previously unthinkable if we are to reduce the spread of this virus in prisons, but we must be sure that there is no danger to the officers, no additional danger, the public and victims by releasing criminals before they're ready. And that means once released, any breach of home detention or any other condition must be detected and dealt with. The police must have the resources to monitor released offenders properly. And if this measure has to happen, it must be for the shortest time possible. It would be helpful if, in closing, the Cabinet Secretary could give the public some idea of which type of prisoners might be eligible for this release and what sort of numbers that might involve being eligible for release. Secondly, Presiding Officer, with only 4 minutes, I cannot elaborate in depth on the proposal to suspend trial by jury. But had this proceeded today, it would be an extraordinary change to the present situation. Alex Cole-Hamilton spoke very well in this regard, and I respect his views thereon. Trial by jury is a fundamental and important protection and a vital safeguard to the powers of the state, which forms a cornerstone of human rights. Let us not forget that the proposal would substitute the decision of 15 people from normal society for a jury of one, who will often be male, one of society's top earners from a particular educational background and of a certain age. Furthermore, I'm not persuaded that such a proposal will prevent delays. Indeed, there's a suggestion that it could exacerbate backlogs in the system. But I think the Law Society make the most sobering point when they say the interests of justice and the rule of law are not served by taking the proposed step at this time. Correct. And I'm pleased to hear the Cabinet Secretary's assurance that he will amend this at stage 2 to seek further discussions on a practical, achievable solution which upholds human rights. Such solutions do exist, and Murdo Fraser listed some of them earlier. Presiding Officer, our support for the principles of this bill is a function of the situation, but it is also conditional and in some cases reluctant. Nevertheless, support it is.
The last of the open debate contributions is from Stuart McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, first of all, I do want to thank the Cabinet Secretary and the Scottish Government for bringing forward this legislation and also for acting so swiftly. I can't welcome it. I don't think anyone can welcome it, but we are where we are in terms of coronavirus. And I think that the swift action that actually has been taken, sadly, has been necessary. I do want to put on record my thanks to everyone who is working on the front line to actually try to help and save lives and help our communities. I want to touch upon just a couple of points briefly, and the first one is on the issue of Schedule 1 regarding housing. And I'd be grateful if the Housing Minister, when he speaks later on, if he can provide some clarity on just kind of one aspect of this. Yesterday, on hearing the announcement about the issue of the extension periods, I received emails and phone calls from people concerned, from constituents, people whose lives are absolutely miserable due to antisocial neighbours. They genuinely are concerned. Like most people, they're staying at home, but so are their antisocial neighbours, particularly those who spoke to me yesterday of a private landlord. But the Housing Minister stated earlier that the antisocial tenants can still be evicted, although this process will be extended by 3 months. Can the Minister provide further clarity on how this will proceed? Will it remain the same process as just now, but only with the 3-month extension period? The second point I want to touch upon is the issue of private landlords. Now, this Parliament hears on a regular basis about the issue of bad and rogue landlords, and there are plenty of them across the country, but also there are plenty of good, decent landlords as well. They are worried about their properties being trashed, the rent not being paid, and also the effects on the neighbours of the property with these extensions. So in the summing up, can the Minister provide some assurances to my constituents who are blighted by antisocial tenants that the extension period will actually not have too much of an adverse effect upon them, but also can the Minister provide some assurances that further engagement will continue with local authorities and also with the private rented sector to ensure that antisocial tenants will not be free to continue to abuse their neighbours without censure?
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I won't be summing up, so I'll answer Mr McMillan now. The exceptions, as I outlined, are for antisocial behaviour or criminality. I think we all will have constituents who face difficulties. We know that this may be exacerbated during the current situation, and that's why we've made those exceptions.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank the Minister for that clarification, that intervention. But certainly, can the Minister just assure me as well that further discussion will be taking place with local authorities and also with the private rented sector, as this, obviously, once the bill has been enacted, to ensure that those assurances are there for all the tenants, certainly not just in my constituency, but across Scotland. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We now move to the closing speeches. And I think that was a yes from the Minister for Mr McMillan, for the record. Closing speeches. Alec Rowley, please, up to 5 minutes. Mr Rowley has metamorphosed into Miss McNeill. Pauline McNeill.
Not an easy thing to do. Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to begin by thanking Scottish Government officials, as others have done, for the incredible drafting work that they've done in an incredibly short period of time. I wholeheartedly agree with Cabinet Secretary Mike Russell that we must work together. We must unite where we can, taking the right steps to manage our society in a dreadful period on everyday issues, and we hope it will be a short period. But I'm sure Cabinet Secretary would agree that we should still do our jobs as an opposition party, but where we think the government can make an improvement on the legislation. We did that last week on the government announcement on a no eviction policy, and we were delighted to welcome the announcement by Aileen Campbell on that. No government, whatever their complexion, can get everything right. So we will be constructive and we will get behind the government in managing the biggest ever crisis our country has faced. So we want to make this work effectively, and I would make the points echoed by Neil Findlay and Alec Rowley that we don't want to overwhelm the government with letters and questions. We do want to scrutinise your work. It would be helpful if you could tell us how. Humza Yousaf said in his opening speech, it's not a time to be bullish or ego-driven, and he is absolutely right about that. Transparency is essential, I think as Murdo Fraser eloquently said, and it's essential that we have an ongoing review. I'd like to mention that Engender have asked specifically that the government look at the impact on women during the coronavirus crisis, as the impact may be different, and whether they'd be willing to give some report as we go forward in this period. I want to address the government proposals on no evictions. I think the banking crisis that we had in 2008 sadly will be a walk in the park with what people might face in this oncoming period. So I welcome everything the government has done here, but there are some things I would like the government to consider going forward. I tend to agree with Andy Whiteman that perhaps isn't the right construction of the legislation to have eviction notice hanging over people's heads, and I want to discuss that further at stage 2. I think the government should also consider going further to help tenants who, no fault of their own, may not be covered by a government scheme or universal credit. So I recognise that we can't see the full picture at the moment, and we'd hope that the millions of people who are self-employed or who have lost their jobs are not covered by the government scheme or are getting a percentage of their wages. We won't see the full impact on that yet. I wholeheartedly welcome the announcement on landlord funds that Graham Simpson raised. But I'd also like the government just to talk to us about whether a system of rent breaks as a last resort. It could be considered further down the line when we have a clearer picture. Looking at even a temporary fund attached to the Scottish Welfare Fund, which will not cover rents at the moment, I appreciate that. For those who may fall through the gap, but who maybe need some short-term help. I'd like the government to look specifically at rent arrears debt. I'll let the Minister in if she so wishes in a minute. I'm just envisaging that one of the issues might be that there might be huge debt that arises, and government may want to consider whether or not a specific scheme might help tenants to try and avoid poor credit ratings and get them back to an even position.
Kevin Stewart.
Presiding Officer, I think one of the key things in all of this is getting messages across to tenants to talk to landlords, and folks should be applying for universal credit where that is the right thing to do. Beyond that, Ms McNeill will know that we have discretionary housing payments and other methods as well. The key thing for me is that folk should pay their rent if they can pay their rent. If they are having difficulties, they should immediately talk to their landlord, whether they're in the social or the private sector, so that we can bring about the flexibilities that are required.
Pauline McNeill.
So there's nothing in that I would disagree with, that people should continue to pay their rent. What I'm trying to address is in cases where we might envisage where they just will not be able to, through no fault of their own, because they may have lost their job or their income. I'd also like the government to look at extending the time that someone can stay in temporary accommodation, that's specifically raised back by shelter. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, as others have done, I recognise that the Cabinet Secretary for Justice has withdrawn probably the most controversial proposal for judge-only trials and solemn procedure. And it's helpful that the Cabinet Secretary did this early in the process. As we all agree, I think, removing the fundamental right of an accused person to be tried in front of their peers, to have comparative justice, and that is the same justice everyone else, is something that we do need to take a bit more time to look at, and I support the idea of a consultation on that. There are dangers in proceeding with juries, obviously dangers to the public. I'm going to wind up at this. I do welcome what the government have done. We will take full part in the consultation. We could look at war times, for example, where they reduce the juries to 7, but we will work with the government to find a solution to this.
Adam Tompkins, for up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to start where the Cabinet Secretary started, which is to say this, that unity in this endeavour is essential. He said it was important, it's essential. We need to work together, and I am grateful, my party is grateful, I think we're all grateful for the way in which the government has tried to ensure that we can work together. This bill, as published yesterday, and as it currently stands, contains measures which in our view go too far. At least in our view go too far at the moment, because the case for their necessity has not been made out. And I want to reflect a little bit more, like I did last week, on that test. We all accept that there is a public emergency threatening the lives of our citizens and threatening, indeed, the life of the nation. We all accept that this is a public emergency which requires an extraordinary response and which requires us as parliamentarians to confer on ministers powers which we wouldn't ordinarily contemplate. But the test which we must vigorously and rigorously apply to the examination of whether those proposals for extraordinary powers are required or not is a test of necessity. Not are they administratively expedient, not would they make our life easier, but are they strictly required? Jenny Gilruth referred to this in her opening remarks. Last week, when we discussed this in the context of the legislative consent motion for the UK's Coronavirus Act, the Cabinet Secretary indicated very strongly his agreement with that this is indeed the test. We will cooperate to confer powers on ministers which are necessary to confer upon ministers to meet the exigencies of the crisis. With regard to, I want to say something about how we apply that test to the two most controversial sets of proposals contained in the bill, the proposals with regard to juries and the proposals with regard to freedom of information. I very much welcome the fact that the Cabinet Secretary and his colleagues have indicated this morning that they will withdraw from the bill today the proposals with regard to juries, albeit that doesn't mean that we've solved the issue. The issue has absolutely not been solved, and we know that we will have to revisit it in a matter of weeks. If there are talks about that process, then I commit myself and my party to take part constructively in those talks. We want to solve this aspect of the coronavirus crisis. Courts must be able to function, but courts must be able to function in a way which uses means that command the widest possible support. That's what the Cabinet Secretary said in his opening remarks, and that do not unnecessarily trammel on the rights and freedoms of those involved in the criminal justice system. And the Cabinet Secretary is right to say that that includes victims as well as defenders. But the rights and freedoms of the accused are paramount in ensuring that we have a fair justice system in our criminal justice order. And there are measures which we need to think about, which are much less restrictive on rights and freedoms than simply abandoning all jury trials for the duration of the crisis. We can think about the consequences of delay. We can think about the logistics of testing jurors or empanelled jurors for coronavirus. We can think about remote juries. We can think about virtual trials. We can think about larger venues. Every cinema and every theatre in Scotland is lying empty at the moment. These are large spaces. They are larger spaces than criminal courtrooms. There are ways, if we can do it here in the Parliament and come together and debate legislation such as this while maintaining social distancing, then it should not be beyond our wit to conceive of ways in which the criminal justice system can do that too. It can't be shown to be necessary to abandon criminal trial by jury in Scotland if no other Commonwealth country in the world is contemplating this when we are dealing with a global pandemic. The Lord Chancellor is not contemplating this in England and Wales. I just want to say something about the way in which the argument for this has been constructed, because if you read carefully the views put in the policy memorandum accompanying the bill as to why this step was one that the Scottish Government wanted to take, it isn't an argument of necessity. It is an argument of administrative convenience. If we don't do this, they say, there will be a backlog of cases. That's not a good enough reason. That's an argument of administrative convenience, not an argument of necessity. And the Law Society are absolutely right to point that out in blunt terms in their submission for today's debate. The potential for a case backlog is not on its own a sufficient reason for departing from the need for jury trial. So we will take part in these talks on a constructive basis, but we will vigorously and rigorously apply this single and simple test. We will support those extraordinary measures which are necessary, and we will not support those which cannot be shown to be necessary. I don't know if I have time, Presiding Officer, to say something about freedom of information in my closing minute or so. The proposals that Jenny Gilruth set out in her opening remarks are welcome. I regret that they don't go as far as I would have wanted them to go. I am not convinced, personally, of the need to extend freedom of information deadlines for anybody other than those working on the front line. I completely understand that health boards, that GP practices, that pharmacies, that anybody working in the NHS has much better things to do, much more important things to do right now than responding to FOI requests. But I am not convinced, personally, that the same argument holds for all government departments. It might hold for local authorities, but I'm not convinced that the same argument holds for all government departments. And I think that even if we take out the extension from, so as I understand the proposal is that we will continue, that we will extend the deadline for dealing with FOI requests from 20 days to 60 days, but we will not thereafter allow the 60-day deadline to be further extended to 100 days. Well, that's welcome, but I just note this, and we'll come back to this, no doubt, at stage 2 and, if necessary, at stage 3, that the bill, as I understand what Jenny Gilruth had to say, and she can correct me if I'm wrong, will continue to provide that Scottish ministers may, by direction, specify further circumstances in which a Scottish public authority may extend a relevant period beyond 60 days. So there's still a substantial degree of flexibility there to avoid or evade ordinary FOI rules, which I think we'll need to look at very carefully indeed when it comes to stage 2.
Thank you very much, Mr Tompkins. And can I call on the Cabinet Secretary, Michael Russell, to conclude our debate?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There's been a great deal in this debate. I will deal with as much as I possibly can, and then, of course, I'll be happy to address other issues outside the Chamber as we go forward, and I'll explain that in a moment. Can I just say a couple of words about two things that haven't been mentioned in this bill? The extension of provisions under the Anatomy Act, which is not a minor matter, but which does require to be done, and a very major matter in terms of provisions under the Adults with Incapacity legislation. These are designed to try and assist in these present situations, but there are times in which space within medical premises will have to be allocated to victims of the disease, and we will have to be able to take appropriate actions. I'd be happy to answer specific questions on those matters. Can I deal with one or two issues very briefly? Under the issue of reporting, Mr Rowley indicated that there may be an amendment from Labour on a one-month reporting. Of course, that would be an entirely legitimate amendment, but I just want to stress that there is, as I indicated, discussion going on about a structure of reporting within this Parliament, which might even be more regular than that if a special committee was set up. So I wouldn't necessarily want to tie anybody's hands on this matter. There is an effective protocol in place to be negotiated quite quickly on secondary legislation for Brexit. I'm sure we could negotiate a protocol with the Parliament very quickly that would allow a special committee to have a function in reporting. And in addition to that, I'm about to start commissioning work on guidelines for reporting across the government. That committee could feed into that, and that work could start almost instantly. So I hope we could perhaps take that forward, rather than changing the legislation, we could take that forward as something we needed to do. Under public safety and Mr. Kelly's point on prisoner release, just to make the point that there will be robust criteria and assessment for release. The regulations for this, giving this power does not mean it will happen. The regulations have to come into place. Clearly, those regulations are open to influencing, and I know the Cabinet Secretary will want to discuss those regulations. Certain categories are already exempt in the bill, and the first choice in terms of the issue raised by Liam Kerr, the first choice would be people to go on home detention curfew. So there would be no blanket release at that stage, but that would reduce the prison population in the way that it would be effective. But again, the Cabinet Secretary is happy to discuss those matters. Mr. Gibson raised issues regarding real hardship that exists, and so did Pauline McNeill. I have to say we are very aware. Every constituency MSP will be aware of real hardship that exists. We're getting emails and contacts on that, not on an hourly basis, almost by minute, and have been for the last 10 days. There are people who fall between the gaps, and Pauline McNeill indicated that at every level, whether that be assistance for self-employed, whether it be in rent, whether it be long-term questions of debt. We do not have all the answers to that at the present moment. And I want to stress that because it is quite unfair to criticise either ministers or officials for not answering inquiries. Sometimes information simply isn't there. And in a system that is being run in terms of some of the support systems from the UK government and some from here, it is difficult to keep up with some of it. We are doing our very best and will continue to do so. The points made on hardship need to be addressed and will be addressed. Mr. Gibson's point about June for self-employed is a very big issue. But an equally big issue is people who are already in debt, who find themselves in further debt as a result of some of these actions. So we are focused on it. I know my colleagues, I know Fiona Hislop, I know Kate Forbes are focused on these issues, and we will continue to try and address them. On jury trials, I just want to make it clear, there is an open invitation. I made it clear, my colleague made it clear, for discussion to take place. The only thing that remains solidly on the table is the imperative to take action. That imperative is being brought to us not, I have to say, to disagree reasonably gently, because I will try and disagree reasonably gently with Mr. Tompkins. This is not about an administrative issue. This is about the effect of the backlog on the accused and, most importantly, on the victims, who have a matter of great difficulty hanging over their head for a long period of time. And that is a point that Victim Support Scotland made to every single member here, when they wrote to every member here. So what is on the table is resolving this issue. But if there are better ways to resolve it than those that the Lord President has brought forward, we wish to see those better ways. And there are certainly some ideas here today. I think the idea of taking over the cinemas of Scotland to hold trials in them, while just slightly Kafkaesque, is probably something that we can look at very seriously. But we need to get on and get a decision on this, and that is why the commitment is there for the bill to be brought to this chamber on the 21st, along with draft regulations, so we can get a solution in place. The final point I want to make is this. We are in a very unusual set of proceedings, presiding officer, as everybody here has reflected. Many people will be busily writing away and planning to table amendments. I just want to make 2 points about it. One is, if this bill can be approved, let us improve it. That has been my position on every bill that I've taken into this chamber. It was my position when we had the exceptional emergency legislation on the continuity bill, and that looks as if it went past like a slow tortoise compared to what we're actually doing on this occasion. That was much criticised by Mr. Tompkins, amongst others. So if it can be, but the best is the enemy of the good, we need to focus on what we can do and what we need to do in terms of amendments. Because otherwise we could sit here all night and into tomorrow and we wouldn't have a better bill. So if any of my colleagues in any party wish to have... yes, I'll take an intervention.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I know there's been much discussion this morning about our justice system and our legal system, rightly so. But I wonder if that commitment to revise and revisit this current legislation, if that also extends to our very many vulnerable adults and elderly people impacted by the considerable changes to adults with incapacity legislation.
Cabinet Secretary.
It does not. I've mentioned briefly the adults with incapacity legislation. I'm happy to discuss with the member in more detail. But the purpose of that is very, very clear, very time limited, and indeed focused almost entirely on ensuring that those who are in very difficult circumstances continue to get the support and help that they need to get. And it is not affected, for example, by a shortage of staff, but it also reflects the needs of the health service. So I'm happy to discuss this matter with the member, but there is no equivalent taking place here. So let me finally make this point. If there are amendments to improve this bill, we want to see them, we need to see them quickly. There are, the bill team is present in the building, I think, in a committee room on this level. Happy to discuss those, and I'm happy to discuss those if people want to do so. If, however, people think in anywhere that a probing amendment would give them an opportunity, come and probe me first. Because you may find I will probe back very vigorously, but please let us focus on what we need to do in this legislation. And with that, Presiding Officer, I commend the general principles of the bill to the Chamber, and I hope that at stage 2 we can focus on what is really important, and in that way we will get this bill through, because it will, and I want to make this point finally, because it will. It's designed to, it has to save lives.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes our Stage 1 debate on the Coronavirus Scotland Bill. And because this is emergency legislation, we'll move straight to the question on the motion. The question is that motion 21370, in the name of Michael Russell, on the Coronavirus Scotland Bill at Stage 1 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The next item is consideration of motion 21377 on a financial resolution for the Coronavirus Scotland Bill. Could I call on Ben McPherson to move this motion? Thank you very much. The question is that motion 21377 in the name of Kate Forbes on the Coronavirus Scotland Bill financial resolution be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. Now, I would advise members at this stage that the deadline for lodging amendments at stage 2 is 12:30 p.m. today, 12:30, and a committee of the whole Parliament will consider the bill at stage 2 from 2:30 p.m. That's all of us sitting in committee in the chamber. Now, the next item of business is the election of an additional Deputy Presiding Officer for the duration of the public response to the novel coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic. This election will use the electronic voting system, but it will be a secret ballot, so only the overall result will be published and not how individual members voted. I can inform members that I've received one valid nomination. That nomination is Lewis MacDonald. So I now declare the election of the Deputy Presiding Officer open, and the question is that Lewis MacDonald be elected as a Deputy Presiding Officer. Members should cast their votes now. Thank you. I can inform members that a majority have voted in favour. Lewis MacDonald is duly elected as Deputy Presiding Officer, and I offer him my congratulations. Thank you. We're now going to move on to the next item of business. It will just be a short pause while ministers and members change seats. Just a short pause.